if every transaction you ever make is fully public and people can know and follow you around, they can kind of know how much money you have. They can know, what you might have to lose, which can lead to a lot of bad situations. The general concept of shielded transactions is really a no-brainer, because calling it a shielded transaction, I think it's almost a misnomer, because it's much closer to what, transactions between people actually should be. When you think about, the majority of human history and how people transacted between each other with cash or coins or tokens of some sort, it wasn't all in a giant globally publicly auditable log. It wasn't using electronic credit cards that reported back to companies. It was much more, person to person, me to you, and respecting in that manner.
If someone, came new to the scene and was like, well, why would I really care about my transaction being shielded?
Weirdly, the government of Canada trying to block all these protesters' accounts, which, regardless of whether or not you agree with what they're saying, like economically sanctioning your own citizens, that's a very draconian thing happening. Situations like that are really, what's in the current zeitgeist of, why shielded transactions matter.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Intelligent Corporation Group, and welcome especially to one of our special Zcash Foundation sponsored podcast episodes of the Shielded Transaction podcast. In this podcast, we interview a variety of different folks, including cryptographers, computer security specialists, privacy activists, and so forth, on why it is that we should not give up shielded transactions, what we may lose by giving them up, and also how it is that we can protect our private life a little bit better in the future. And so I'm really, really happy today to be joined by Why Are You Sleeping? He was the first engineer at Protocol Labs, apparently also a technical advisor at Twitter's Blue Sky, which I didn't know until stalking your Twitter yesterday. So very cool. Maybe we get into that too. And you care very deeply about IPFS, LIP2P, CoinList, Filecoin, and Estuary. Maybe we can talk about that also a little bit. And according to your Twitter bio, you live on Earth, but on GitHub, you live in the metaverse. So we have to figure that one out as well, where you are these days.
It's difficult.
It's very difficult. But I'm glad that, that you're in dual locations. Okay, wonderful. So maybe to bring people up to speed, this is our third part of the Shielded Transaction podcast. We started off quite strong with Andrew Miller. He had a really wonderful, fantastic bounty that we're still about to release. So get excited for that. Then we followed up with Zooko. And so now I'm really, really happy to have you here. Why? And I'm very grateful for Zooko to have connected us in the first place. So thanks a lot for making time. I know that, there's probably a bunch of other people in the room here backstage that can ask much better questions than I can, but I'll start with a few like softballs, and then maybe we can see if others have questions too. So it's always a very, I guess, community-oriented podcast episode. Okay, cool. So maybe to bring people up to speed, just introduce yourself perhaps in a few words, and perhaps you could also tell us a little bit about, what got you into the cryptography or security space, and so far as you're in it right now, and how did you see the entire field shift a little bit, just to provide some color on what is the field about? What got you excited about it? And where are we now?
Yeah, so I'm Why Are You Sleeping? In real life, I sometimes go by Jeremy. And I've been working at Protocol Labs for about 8 years now. And I initially got excited about, working on IPFS because it seemed like a very utopian ideal of having access to all the information from anywhere and having it be able to, trustlessly access whatever data you wanted. It seemed like a really cool thing. So I just wanted to use it. And it turned out that it didn't quite exist yet at the time. It was just an idea in a white paper. So I started helping out, contributing open source. And at some point, Juan offered me a job, and I ended up being the first employee at the company. and spent, most of the past 8 years learning a ton about how open source works, how cryptography works, how peer-to-peer systems work, how local first networks work, and really just enjoying a lot of the interesting things that the space has to offer. In, I think, 2016, I don't remember how I heard about Zcash, but I think I met Zuko in Berlin, and he was excitedly talking about, this new thing he was going to start working on. And shortly after that, I started mining Zcash for fun on the testnet. And then when it launched, I was, had a Zcash miner running on the mainnet. And that was a kind of a really fun experience. But it definitely got me excited about Zcash and the potential, applications that it could bring.
Wonderful. That it's always really interesting to know how people actually meet, and then what kind of life paths that unlock for them. So it's interesting how idiosyncratic that always is. But perhaps to bring folks a little bit up to speed on what is the cryptography space in general. If we think of that as an enabling technology of shielded transaction in the first place, what does that entail for you, or what got you even interested in the space, and where do you think your focus areas lie here a little bit?
The general concept of shielded transactions is really a no-brainer, because calling it a shielded transaction really, I think it's almost a misnomer, because it's much closer to what transactions between people actually should be. When you think about the majority of human history and how people transacted between each other with cash or coins or tokens of some sort, it wasn't all in a giant globally publicly auditable log. It wasn't using electronic credit cards that reported back to companies. It was much more person to person, me to you, and respecting in that manner. And so the whole shielded transaction idea really respects that a lot more than most digital payment systems out there.
I can talk to why we use the term shielded transactions. We were trying to come up with a word to distinguish it from transparent transactions. If Zcash hadn't had transparent transactions, then there would have been no need for the word shielded in that context. I completely agree that basically transactions need to be shielded.
Daira, do you want to say just who you are? Because since this is a podcast.
Hi, Daira Hopwood, pronouns Z here. I'm a designer of Zcash. I've been with the company, first the Zcash company, then ECC from the start, really. And I'm the lead author on the Zcash protocol spec.
Wonderful. And can one of you, since we're already deep into the semantics here, give some more coloring on why shielded transactions and not private transactions? Any points on this? Or
to be honest, I can't remember why we didn't say private.
I think that in conversations it was usually just a little bit more of a distinguished and individualized and teased out way of saying what was meant by this, rather than the more private term, which I think often has a bunch of different connotations as well for individual people. So trying to basically reclaim the term a little bit and making it your own again, which is interesting. Yeah. I think once you have a term and it flies, which you have with nanotechnology, then a bunch of people pile on the term, which you had the same with AI, then a bunch of people pile on the term, and you kind of have to carve out your own little niche again by just inventing a new word for it.
Yeah, I remember now. So privacy is kind of an ambiguous word. I mean, you have things like the GDPR, which are not actually preventing the information from being readable. They're saying nicely to people, don't spread this personal information, which is not really the concept that we wanted to get at.
Wonderful. Okay, we nailed it. I like this group brainstorming. Nice. Okay, cool. So perhaps you can bring us a little bit up to speed, right, on why it is that we should even care about this in the first place. Like, what if someone came new to the scene and was like, well, why would I really care about my transaction being shielded? Perhaps you can even point to a few international geopolitical events that make that a little bit more, have a bit more hand and foot for people that may stumble into this field as a layperson?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated topic because on one hand, you have various governments that go into controlling how people spend and use their currency, and using a lot of the surveillance systems to track how people spend their money and track what people do there. And from that perspective, there's definitely a lot of bad situations that can arise. You see, weirdly, the government of Canada trying to block all these protesters' accounts, which, regardless of whether or not you agree with what they're saying, like economically sanctioning your own citizens, that one seems a bit weird to me. And that's like a very near to home country, like especially to me in the northern United States. Like, Canada's right across the border. Like, that's a very draconian thing happening not too far from home. And situations like that are really what's in the current zeitgeist of why shielded transactions matter. I think you run into a lot of other situations on the broader, less immediate, more subtle scale, where if every transaction you ever make is fully public and people can know and follow you around, they can kind of know how much money you have. They can know, what you might have to lose, which can lead to a lot of bad situations. If, for example, rule of law breaks down, you can be subject to more extortion. You can be all sorts of, scary things that definitely we don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but we also do have some baseline level of privacy in, our day-to-day transactions. Like, sure, spending money with your credit card isn't actually all that private, but it is at least private to a certain set of people. And it's harder to get to than if everything was just, on Bitcoin, fully public. My take is generally not that everything should be completely private. I think there are situations where you actually do need some accountability. There's a number of systems that are starting to think about this problem where, like, potentially, you exist within the government, within the government's rule, and you need to at least be able to respect, provably, and with as much privacy as possible, some of the asks that they have.
Cool. Okay. Later on, I think we'll get a little bit also into the more what's like a gray scenario between like the like everything transparent and everything private or shielded.
Can I jump in for a little bit?
Jump in.
So as well as just not revealing how much money you have, which obviously is an important thing for your safety, there's all kinds of other things that can be inferred about you by where you spend money or where you get money from. Even your sexuality, medical conditions that you might have, if you take drugs, even if they're only just frowned upon by society rather than actually being illegal. There are things that might get you into trouble with your employer and so on. So if you don't have financial privacy, then you can't have privacy. You can't have privacy for the things that, if we were talking about communications, it would be more obvious to people that should be encrypted.
Okay, cool. Well, I think I usually like to think of it as like the moment that you think that privacy is important, it's kind of the moment that it's too late. And so it's the type of thing that is like always kind of like a hidden benefit until when it matters, then it's kind of too late to care about it. So yeah, very, very much agree. Okay, wonderful. So perhaps we can jump in a little bit on like what it actually is that you're working in at the moment and what you're currently focused on. I think there were a few really interesting tweets recently that I saw. For example, you recently tweeted that Filecoin built the highest volume deployment of zk-SNARK secrets in existence to date. And then Zooko was super thrilled and retweeted that this came out of the Groth 16 proof that Zcash deployed and the Zcash stapling release. So why is this so exciting? Like that's I guess a very like specific question, but maybe we start right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting because this is, Zcash was the first network to really get snarks out into being, used by anybody, let alone just, an implementation that works. And that took the state of the cryptography a long ways. And one of the reasons, aside from me thinking Filecoin is cool and all, that I'm excited that, we built this huge deployment of ZK Snark circuits is that we're pushing the boundaries of the technology and really investing a lot in the research and engineering side of how can we do this faster and better and more, and really addressing the scalability concerns, because the first release of Zcash, it took 5 minutes or something to actually make a shielded transaction.
So if you're talking about the original Zero Cash circuit, that definitely took more than a minute. And we reduced the number of constraints in Sprout by 2. So that took about, I think it was 50 seconds typically, something like that.
And then in one of the later releases, it's now down to just a few seconds. And then I think if you take that circuit and apply some of the code optimizations that we've made over in the Filecoin side, you can get that same circuit down even faster. And we have a GPU prover. So you can utilize, graphics cores in order to compute this much, much faster, to the point where it's entirely unnoticeable if you want to do these, zero knowledge circuits for your transactions. And the more scalable we get them, the faster you can compute these snarks, the more interesting circuits you can do. So Zcash itself is a very simple payment protocol. It doesn't allow any programmability. It doesn't allow you to, write smart contracts. Full stateful smart contracts aside, it, doesn't let you do things like Bitcoin script, which is a much simpler and reduced set of, operations. With more advanced zero knowledge proofs, you could have some scriptability into that transaction and still have it have the same UX. And not, take minutes to compute your transaction proof. Us pushing the state of the art on how fast we can do these things is why I'm excited.
Very cool. Wow. What a learning curve here. Very nice. Are you involved in any other cryptographic tools that you just want to throw out here? I think it always helps to just see a little bit of what's even available, right? Many people, I think, aren't even aware of all of the kind of tools that really from the outside do look like magic, the types of things that you can do with them. Even zero knowledge proofs do look like magic from the outside, I think. And in fact, are often, being showcased through magic tricks. At least that's how Zooko does it. But, could you perhaps point to a few that you're particularly excited about? I think I saw you tweeting about a proof of space-time recently. Perhaps you want to color in on why that's exciting, or pick any other one that you may be excited about.
Yeah, there's a bunch of cool stuff happening. I think one of the ones that is on the same order of magic as a zero knowledge proof is homomorphic encryption and general shielded computation, as I've heard it called, where you can execute a program without even knowing what you're executing and have it be verifiable that you did it correctly. The technology here is still a long ways away from being practical for most use cases, but there's a number of groups I've seen working on it and trying to make it faster and trying to build hardware to do the operations faster. And if we had a practical primitive for this that worked well, there'd be a large number of things would become possible that are currently not. You could, hypothetically remove all trust from servers while still having servers. A server could not know what it's computing on. It could not actually be able to decrypt your data, but it could still operate over it. It could still, store it for you, and it could still service API requests even for you. And there's just a number of crazy things you could do here that are amazing for privacy. If only we had this, primitive functional. There's also a lot of stuff happening in federated learning where you can take your own private data and contribute it to a machine learning model, without actually leaking your information. And this is hard to do. I don't know if anybody's really done it with full privacy. I think in a lot of cases where I've seen federated learning, you can still infer some individual information, but I know there's a number of groups, I think OpenMind has been working on fully differentially private federated learning, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, Andrew Trask wrote a really fantastic post on Save AI using federated learning.
Nice.
And it's really wonderful because it also protects the algorithm from knowing really what it's computing on. So that could, if you care about long-term AGI and about that safety, that could also be a potential benefit. I think, Daira, I saw you unmuting. Do you want to fill us something in?
Yeah, so I'm quite encouraged by the fact that we now know how to do pretty much all of cryptography in a post-quantum, so resistant to quantum computers way. We don't know yet whether it will be possible to build feasible quantum computers, but if we could, that would break a lot of the cryptography that is currently being used. But actually quite recently, knowing how to do ZK SNARKs in a post-quantum way with good proof sizes and being able to do recursive proofs, that was kind of an unsolved problem. And there's a recent scheme called Plonky 2 that basically solves that problem, in my opinion. So yeah, we know how to do signatures, key exchange, and now ZK SNARKs, all in a post-quantum way.
Oh, that's awesome. I hadn't heard of Plonky 2 yet.
It's well worth looking at. Uses some of the ideas from Halo 2. It's using Fry commitments, if you know what that is. That's the same kind of commitments that are used in STARKs.
Wonderful. Cool. We need a little tutorial next time. I think when listeners are interested, we had Suko discuss at least Halo 2 recently on, and so that's probably in our archives somewhere if someone Googled for it. Okay, cool. So now that we have at least a little bit of the landscape covered, like very roughly, or at least in tidbits, what's interesting about it, maybe we can get back to, on the long run, why ought we care or why would one care? And, what is it also that we can do to actually protect ourselves better? And I think that, from a consumer angle, I think that's specifically exciting for people that are working in the space. And so could you perhaps fill in a little bit? I think Mark Miller always likes to paint this dystopia of a future in which, for example, mass traffic analysis can lead to actually physical extortability of anyone who ever transacted using a public blockchain. And I think if we actually are serious about moving much of our commerce into crypto commerce, and especially linking that to our physical places, especially if we, actually wanted to order stuff on there, then, that would be potentially quite dangerous. So perhaps as a consumer, if I was listening to this, what could I do to really protect myself a little bit better when I'm out there, especially transacting Web3 or crypto commerce or what have you?
Yeah, I think being very aware that most cryptocurrencies are not private is just really the most important thing. And as you're thinking about how to use these technologies, being aware that the things you do for the most part are not just, public, they're part of the permanent indelible record that will never be removed. Keeping that in mind, and not the, Bitcoin is anonymous thing that gets parroted around randomly, is just important. Just for the average consumer who's not deep in the tech, knowing what is private and what is not, and what that means for your data, I think is going to help people make the right decisions often.
Okay, so it's not really like there's a specific, bit that you would recommend.
I think, using a system like Zcash is the better approach, but it's not practical for most people right now because, most merchants don't accept it. The adoption isn't there, and so at the current stage that we're at, it's not easy to do the right thing. I don't know, Daira, if you have any takes here, but we're in a weird spot in the space right now.
I think just being aware of the fact would already be pretty good. I think it's very easy to forget, right? And so, I think caution for now, maybe a good policy. But I actually, when I did some digging a while back into some Zcash affiliated project, there was something called Zbay. And so they, I think, were trying to recreate an eBay using more of the Zcash blockchain, which would be interesting if you actually wanted to, give away your personal address or whatever, what have you. But maybe these things are still a little bit, maybe like V2. Okay, wonderful. So for people actually moving from consumers to actually people like building bits in the space. Why is it, for example, even interesting for people that are actually building products out, or like dApps or what have you, in Web3, to actually care about having Shido transactions be part of them, right? I think actually Kate Sills, who's on this call, actually once made a comment that public blockchains could enable really anti-competitive behavior, for example, by allowing the next Amazon to analyze the world's transactions in detail, and then to really cover rising products and stuff. And so those are, I think, more indirect effects, but nevertheless some that we should probably pay attention to. And so perhaps you have a few ideas here as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about if all the world's transaction data were actually fully public, what would the carry-on effects be? And so let's say, there's a new Amazon that, say existing Amazon has all of their transaction data public on a blockchain, assuming we got the scalability problems figured out for that. Now, a new company comes along and is looking at all of this data and trying to arbitrage, and do something better by making use of all this data. The question is, can they avoid contributing the same data to the system? So if everybody else's data is public, but theirs is private, then they can get an advantage. And that's where the issue is. If there's an information asymmetry, then you end up in a weird spot here where one company has an advantage just because they are using, privacy preserving technology and hiding information that other people would, be able to make use of otherwise. If everybody has to use the fully public thing, then, well, everybody's kind of on the same playing field in terms of a competitive advantage. So I think it's, you need, all of one or all of the other. And I definitely prefer all of, more private than all of less private.
If I can chime in here, I think, to me, it seems like having fully public blockchains is a complete non-starter for businesses adopting blockchains. So I think it's not that we're going to see all businesses have to deal with public blockchains. I think it's that we're going to see them just rejecting the blockchain industry as a whole, except for, these research arms that they might try to spin off. And I think we saw this with the Constitution DAO, unfortunately, where their maximum bid was public because they had, this on-chain treasury. And so they were able to be outbid, and they weren't able to have the same bidding strategies as a normal bidder would.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. Like somebody just looks and sees, oh, they can only spend this much. Great, easy win. And yeah, the point being, if companies are trying to make the decision to use, a particular payment technology, and what they currently have is, Stripe or, standard credit card payment networks, that gives them enough privacy because their competitors are not likely to be able to just go and read all their data. And if they're looking at giving that up and losing, you're like giving somebody else a competitive advantage for, what's the trade-off they're making here? And I think that's where the tricky bit happens. And I do think you're right that they're just not going to make that trade-off.
Look at me doing my hand thing. So I think one of the things that's key to think about this is right now we're in this sort of weird world of fake privacy, which is in order to keep some of these principles that we're thinking about, where like transactions aren't available for everyone to see, or we can store data and we can share it selectively with people. We're having to do this thing or participate in this thing that Bruce Schneier calls feudal security, which is basically we have to entrust some organization to do this for us. And the deal that we have with that organization is in return, they get to see all our data. So for instance, with a bank, they keep all of these accounting details private to everyone except themselves. So they get this insight. And of course, their motivations for keeping that private and when they keep it private are very different from the end user. Sometimes compared to the average user, sometimes compared to like other cases, right? So the classic one for me was an organization, a nonprofit that I worked with in the past, that is very cautious about privacy. The organization that kept all of our records didn't feel that addresses were that important. That like, oh, if this got exposed, and to be clear, they were keeping them private, but I was interrogating them about how private, like how well protected. Are these encrypted? What are they? And they were like, well, it's just addresses. You know, that's public information. And of course, for many people on the internet, their address is an extremely private bit of information, and that privacy can change over time. So what we're really looking at here is not only trying to recreate the kind of privacy that we expect in our living room or in our normal environment, but trying to create it in a way in the digital space that doesn't require us sort of essentially inviting someone into that room to make sure everything keeps private. I think that's a real challenge. Like, how do we build this without having third parties knowing everything about us? And that's where homomorphic encryption and all of these processes are about. They're about doing it without having to trust someone absolutely.
It's also important to say that we actually cannot trust some of these big organizations. I was just looking up now the Equifax data breach. That leaked private information of 150 million US citizens, 15 million British citizens. Information that could be used for identity theft. So we just cannot trust the centralization of everyone's data into honeypots that can easily be attacked.
Wonderful. I love that we're already moving to a very collaborative podcasting here. I have 3 more hands up, so maybe we'll just move through Brad, David, and Adrian, and then we'll loop into a new question. So Brad, you go.
Well, I mean, I've tried to look at this from a lot of different directions and what the public is interested in, as well as what we privacy advocates are interested in. And I think we need to get a better understanding of that, get a better understanding of what people are going after. In particular, one type of transaction that's seen a lot of criticism is the transaction to an anonymous recipient, where the sender does not know who the anonymous recipient is, which is unfortunately commonly used for ransomware payment, and it wasn't really practical to do before. And this has attracted a great deal of negative public attention. And I've been curious about what the positive values are of transactions to anonymous recipients. And there may be some, but whether they outweigh those is another question. Historically, we've been comfortable with the idea that police can do investigations under what used to be the old system, namely, there's probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed, they get a warrant, they get special investigatory powers, and then they can dig into things like private financial data and other things in order to do their investigations. We've become very scared about the fact that the modern computerized world allows broad data analysis, phishing expeditions, finding you because they see everyone's data finding you. And we want to stop that large scale of privacy invasion going on, but most people actually still want to protect the power of the police to do this. Another recent thing that's made the news is the question of whether cryptocurrencies make it impossible to block things, for example, like Russia moving its assets around and hiding it when it's become an international pariah for engaging in atrocities and war actions. And many people would like to say they don't want a financial system where we can't stop that. And so how do we balance these needs from the needs we've just mentioned, the desire, of course, to have our own personal transactions be private, to not have large analysis be done of it, for leaks not to happen? How do we make that balance? Because a pure approach to absolutely zero knowledge transactions means no one can ever reverse the privacy, not even the person who made the transaction and not even people who have a warrant.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the answer is somewhere in the middle. Like, everything being completely private from everybody else is, one end of the extreme, and everything being completely open and public is the other end. And definitely there's a middle ground to toe.
Zcash does support viewing keys, which are keys that allow you to see selectively information about, say, all of the transactions into an address or going out from an address. I'd like to push back on the idea that anonymous recipients are a problem. because in practice, if you leak recipient information, you're giving an adversary a lot of information that they can then use as a starting point to make inferences about the transaction graph. If you start with a system in which you're hiding as much information as possible, then you can selectively disclose information. If you start with a system that reveals things by default, it's very difficult to do that.
Indeed, but what's been enabled is the transaction where the sender is not even allowed to get any information about the recipient. I'm not talking about overseeing entities getting information about the recipient, but even the sender can't in a typical cryptocurrency transaction, other than through leaks like Bitcoin. Of course, we've seen many examples of people discerning what's going on, even though it wasn't intended. So that's where these special attributes that you can add to a transaction optionally don't assist you, because of course the ransomware author is telling you you need to pay me by only by a fully private transaction, a recipient anonymous transaction. So so I've been interested in what values have been put forward for that particular type of recipient anonymous transaction, the type that a ransom demander likes, that would make us say we want that transaction. Because if there's no actual positive use of it, maybe we should not want to implement it.
Perhaps we'll go to David and Adrian next for quick comments, and then I can tie them up again, and we'll loop back onto the question train.
Yeah, I think this is actually closely related to the discussion that was occurring. So there's a trade-off between unremovable privacy and selectively viewable transactions. So there are a lot of places where, like, you really want to be able to prove that you've paid, or you need to be able to be audited, and you want to allow kind of selectively your accountant to be able to claim this, or have some way to do that, versus the problem that, like, you don't want somebody to be able to, show up with a rubber hose and smack you until you give them the key to make sure that, like, the government can always show up and say, like, okay, we're putting you in jail unless you reveal this, unless there's some class of transactions that can't be revealed even if you want to. I'm interested in how you view that trade-off, and like what the system can allow or what it should allow.
Yeah, why do you want to answer that directly?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this direction where, as Dara says, starting with a fully private, but then having selective disclosures, and then even taking it one step further and like opting into specific selective disclosures automatically, I think is an interesting take, where if you look at systems like CAPE or this one I just saw today called UTT, they're different systems that allow you to bake in policies about disclosure where, for example, UTT gives the example of saying all of your monthly transactions that total less than a certain amount are fully private. And then if you go above a certain amount, it starts to be reported in some specific manner that is agreed upon publicly by the policy. And these, I think, are the types of systems that are a bit more practical to, more, maybe not more practical, but more palatable to, governments. And in order for these things to actually take off and for us to actually get the level of privacy we need, you have to have mass adoption. And that's going to imply, a tacit approval by whatever government you happen to be, beholden to.
Great. Adrian.
I want to talk a little bit about this middle ground that why keeps coming back to between accountability and privacy. And in terms of reputation, I would have expected, I'm not at all an expert, that after, given the technology of zero knowledge proofs and the experience that we've already had out there, that there would be some advance in contextual reputation keeping. Systems put in place, like we're working on, decentralized storage, fundamentally, that groups could adopt in order to introduce reputation in a fair and game-resistant way. And I'm curious why I haven't heard more about this zero knowledge technology being put in this context.
This is definitely a very interesting one to me because it circles back around to identity. You know, as you're talking about reputation, you can't have reputation without some notion of identity to tie that reputation to. And in a lot of ways, we don't really have any form of decentralized identity yet. We have, you know, your online identity tends to be your Facebook or your Twitter or your email. And then tying things provably to that, you know, is doable. You know, you have like Twitter blue checks, right? And you have like, you know, you can have a Wikipedia page, which is a level of reputation, right? But these are all very like fragile and manually developed things. And until we have like a real, you know, identity system out there, and, you know, maybe moving to things like trust graphs and different, you know, certifications and attestations that can apply to these decentralized identities, it's hard to get into having a reputation in these systems. But once you do have this, you can start having really cool proofs where you can prove that you hold a specific credential without revealing it, or you can prove that you have some form of reputation without even revealing who you are, which I think is where these things get really interesting. The zero knowledge proofs for these things actually end up being pretty straightforward. It's just having the things to prove in the first place. It doesn't exist yet.
Okay, wonderful. I think that actually there was a very long ago piece written by Mark Miller and maybe Eric on pseudonymous reputation, which I think was also referred to here just now in the chat. And yeah, that's definitely, I think, an interesting middle ground. But perhaps we are already at the middle ground question. So if you already have, I feel like we've been circling around this the whole time. And so if you do have, you know, other bits to say on this one of, you know, is there some kind of, you know, golden middle between shielded and non-shielded transactions that, you know, we could aim towards that would maybe be more palatable for all sides, where we can reap the best of all worlds? Like, what would such a future look like?
This is something that I find really interesting because as I'm thinking down this path, I see transactions and payments and like your ability to transact with an economy as a form of just general communication. And, you know, when you look at the internet has given us the ability to communicate at like as broadly as ever has been possible in human existence. And we see a lot of weird side effects coming out of this. You have weird internet communities that get susceptible to misinformation that cause weird things like QAnon groups, and like all of this weird things that happen as a result of the fundamental layer of how we communicate has changed dramatically. And I think applying the same thing to money is going to potentially have other weird effects because, you know, the way you spend money is a form of communication. It all comes back to what we've been talking about just a minute ago of accountability. As you're participating in the economy, if you participate in a bad way, how, you know, bad is subjectively defined, and it's defined by whatever group you might be part of. And it is likely up to that group to hold you accountable. And figuring out how to have a private but accountable monetary system is really, I think, the golden ticket here. I don't really have many answers, but I've definitely seen some cool research around this, like the UTT paper I mentioned, and also CAPE, which is like a configurable asset privacy protocol. These are really interesting. I don't know if they're the right solution yet, but they're, I think, moving in a good direction.
I'm going to argue for the fully private thing as the golden middle, because I think we live in an unbalanced society, a society where there is a lot of power in the hands of governments, large corporations, centralized bodies in general. And whatever we can do to claw back some power for the people is a good thing. I think that would be rebalancing our society.
Yeah, I don't entirely disagree. I think that given the current state of the world, I do tend to agree. I think given a particular ideal, there's different, it's obviously complicated. I'm not going to like plant my flag in the ground and say, this is where I'll die. But it's definitely worth exploring, you know, what might happen in these situations. Like, you know, there are there are things we can all agree that are bad that people can do with money and communications over the internet. And are there other ways of combating that aside from, holding people accountable through their communication mechanisms?
I mean, let's take the case of ransomware. A ransomware attack is going to leave traces other than the payment. And those are probably what you need to focus on tracing. If someone has to break into your computer, that is going to leave traces.
I don't know if that's sufficient, though. Like
that's the thing you actually have to prevent, not the paying of money.
Right. So I feel like money is, and we've seen this in a lot of the attention that's being paid to the crypto space, where there are a lot of behavior, both good and bad, that is been enabled by having a versatile digital currency that reflects the characteristics of cash, right? And that's acting as a forcing function in a lot of other areas of weakness in society, right? That most particularly, I think, computer security. But we have to fix computer security. Like the fact that we're seeing very visible targeted attacks being successful and then getting and being worthwhile, economically worthwhile, because there is a possibility of this reward, right? If we were to make all digital monetary transactions visible, then we would be still in a situation where that security was available, was still weak. It would just be that the attackers would have to spend a little bit much more money on covering their tracks, right? And if you have billions of dollars of private information or vulnerabilities, which we have, right? Computer security is so weak that we're essentially stashing trillions of dollars behind extremely weak walls. And then when somebody comes in, right, they can spend $1 billion on protecting their identity and still make a profit. So I think that ultimately, I mean, I don't even know whether this is a medium or long-term goal. It certainly seems like a goal where rather than deliberately weakening some parts of security in order to defend already weak other parts of security, it seems like the important thing to do is to strengthen all of the security. And I think we're just fast forwarding into a future rather than kind of walking off into some alleyway that we can get out of. This is going to be the future that we're in, whatever happens. And so we have to fix it rather than pretend that we can come up with solutions that will take us out of this future.
We actually have missed so many opportunities to improve computer security. And the reason for that is capitalism, in my opinion.
Why? Do you want to answer to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with everything Danny says, just, on principle. But I think he's right. There's, a lot of other aspects to the particular problem being solved that compromising on privacy in some ways is one solution. Doing other things to solve the same problem, is likely the better solution. I think, to play devil's advocate a little bit, I think given how difficult it has been so far to actually get good computer security, especially in light of all these, things like Spectre and Meltdown and, deep security vulnerabilities at the processor level, is it practical to have like any expectation that your computer isn't completely owned at all times? I don't know.
Mark usually at this point always points to SEL4 and it's like the one saving grace, and we're very happy to have them on again very soon. But yeah, it's difficult. And maybe David with a comment, and then I want to have 2 more questions. We're already nearing the end of time, and it has been wonderful, but we definitely have so much still to cover.
So the question of computer security, I think, is really important for a lot of things. And the question I've wondered a lot, and I feel like many people in the audience probably have useful thoughts on this, but is if you could get incentive compatible like sharing of costs and like get people to pay for it, how much would it actually cost to rebuild like systems from the ground up secure? Is that a $10 billion project? Is it a $100 billion project, which are very large sums, but also aren't unimaginably large? Or is it like we could spend $1 quadrillion and we don't think we have any way to do it?
I've always been skeptical of the idea that we can't do something because we would have to rebuild everything, because we rebuild everything anyway, right? Our technology changes to the point that we are not using things that were designed 20 years ago anymore, for the most part. I mean, there are obviously some exceptions. So if we made a concerted effort to research the approaches that have some realistic chance of success. I mean, I'm a fan of capability systems, but that's not the only approach. We should all be using memory safe languages. If we did that, then we could solve this problem within the next 20 years.
I think the main thing there is just adoption. Like, we know how to build better, safer software with, yes, I agree, like object capability based systems for every component of the stack would be better, but then how do we get it into everybody's computers? That's always been the tricky part of all these technologies is, can you get Apple to ship it?
You can do all of this. The question is making things like 90% more secure effectively wasting all of your time because you're still going to have a bunch of vulnerabilities? Or like, would that actually do it? Like would dealing with all of the types of vulnerabilities that we like currently know how to fix be enough to make ransomware non-viable because it's so hard to get into systems? Or would it just like, oh, and here are the other 20 ways that they have to attack it that we hadn't thought of yet?
Probably not. It probably wouldn't actually have an effect, because most of these like computer fraud things now come down to social engineering. There's so much, fraud that happens that's entirely not related to an actual, security issue, in the strictest sense of the word. It's, people are too trusting of other people, and you can call somebody and claim to be somebody else. And a lot of times that'll work.
So rebuilding the system doesn't.
I'm actually optimistic that you can change the processes to remove those weak points, even the social engineering ones.
Yeah.
Well, we are likely going to start a new technical seminar series on OCAPs and different ways of getting to computer security up next after the Shielded Transaction podcast. So perhaps we can table that discussion also for then. I want to make sure that we hit the bounty question, because this is not just about talking the podcast, but it's also really about enabling people to actually engage with privacy preserving or shielded transactions. And so we usually ask the question at the end of this, and then we give a Gitcoin bounty, and ideally in the future, like an actual ZACK bounty on proving that you've done it. And so if you could think of something, like cook something up that people can already do in their homes and to really dabble in shielded transactions, and that they can then win a bounty for, that would be really wonderful. Why?
Yeah, I think, kind of related to a lot of the topic of discussion, if somebody can send a shielded transaction to somebody else, you could send one to me, I can provide my address if you want, but then provide a payment disclosure to claim the bounty. So you can reveal what the transaction you have sent was. I'm not sure how advanced the tooling in Zcash for this is. I know it exists, but I don't know, maybe you can just reveal parts of it, or if it's all or none.
It exists for Sprout. You have to enable an experimental option. It's a bit clunky.
Sounds like a fun adventure for somebody.
I think so. I mean, sounds like it's worthy of a bounty. I think the last one we even had Zooko sending little messages with the transaction. So I think you can get creative. Let's see which messages you get by. Okay, wonderful. We have 1 minute left, and I do want to get to, I think, your favorite question, which is, are there any bits why we should be excited about private or like about zero knowledge proofs or other cryptographic tools, because they enable new things that we cannot currently do?
Yeah, I have this kind of pet idea that I've been playing around with for a while, but with really fast and Turing complete zero knowledge proofs, you can build games that are entirely trustless. You can play a game with somebody else, like, for example, an RPG even, and the outcome of your play against and somebody else's play can be entirely validated to be correct. You can also do interesting things like play a roguelike game, which is a one-player game, but has randomness. by playing with a server where the server just provides a commitment to the randomness and reveals the randomness in its move choices as you play. So you can have a provable execution of an entire game that does include randomness that's hidden from the player. And this can be, done to play like on-chain games where you can actually stake. You could stake money on you actually winning the game or not, which I find really fascinating. The things moving in this direction of being able to not have to trust anybody, but not have to do it all on chain.
Yeah, I think that's always like a really compelling reason. Like we want that future also because of the new things that it enables, not just because it can patch a few of the holes that I think that we left off. Okay, wonderful. I'm so happy for you to join us. And thank you everyone for making this such a collaborative podcast. It was really fun. And it's working well, I think, to just have it be more of a group discussion. Why I can't thank you enough for joining us. It was really wonderful to have you on. Thank you, everyone. Before we close, I just want to remind people that we have 2 things coming up that are happening very soon. Number 1 is we have the Gaming the Future book club coming up. And so this is the book that we already published. I posted the link here in the chat. We have Gitcoin bounties to all of the chapters, and you kind of helped us write it throughout the last year. And so thanks for that. And we have we had really wonderful speakers last year. And now we have a really wonderful book club coming up with many of them coming back and actually discussing where the book is now. And then if you're at ETH Amsterdam, we're having a DeSci Science Day. And so this one will be on April 20th, and the tickets are now open. And so you're welcome to join us there in case you're at ETH Amsterdam and if you want to discuss decentralized approaches to science. So those are 2 bits where you can find us very soon. And with that, we're now 2 minutes over time. Just want to thank everyone for joining again. I'm really excited for the next one. And if you want to chat more, you can come to our Discord server where I'll be hanging out most of the day. Thank you, Y, and thanks everyone for such a fantastic podcast. Bye, everyone. It was lovely.
Thanks, everybody.